You all must have heard what Trump said about the BRICS nations, including India. He said, everyone in the BRICS will face an additional 10% tariff on the exports to the United States if they remain in the BRICS bloc. So it is now out in the open. The US president doesn't want BRICS bloc to grow any further.
It's not every day that two seemingly separate storms America's worst debt crisis and the growing unity of the BRICS bloc collide in a way that could reshape the global balance of power. But that's exactly what's unfolding right now. On one side, Washington is staring down numbers so big they almost defy belief. On the other, an alliance of emerging powers is finding strength in the very pressure meant to weaken it. America's $37 trillion problem. The numbers are staggering. As of August 8, 2025, the U.S. national debt stood just shy of $37 trillion, a level the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget once predicted wouldn't be reached until 2030. The pace is breathtaking. According to Michael A. Peterson, head of the Peter G. Peterson Foundation, the country is adding another $1 trillion to the debt every 5 months. That means the recent $5 trillion increase to the federal debt limit, the largest in U.S. history, could be burned through in just 2 years. What makes this moment even more striking is that the U.S. isn't in a recession or pandemic. The economy is growing, yet deficits remain enormous. The Congressional Budget Office says that before President Donald Trump's latest sweeping tax and domestic spending bill, the so-called mega bill, was even signed, the government was on track to spend $1.9 trillion more this fiscal year than it collected. With the new legislation, the CBO projects nearly $3.4 trillion in additional deficit spending over the next decade. The math doesn't stop there. That mega bill pushed the federal debt limit to $41.1 trillion, but the CBO estimates the debt will top $52 trillion by the end of fiscal 2035. At the same time, America's GDP, the total value of all goods and services produced, was $30.3 trillion in the second quarter of 2025, while the debt stood at $36.2 trillion. That's a debt-to-GDP ratio of 119.4%, meaning the U.S. owes far more than it produces in a year. The weight of interest payments. Debt at that scale comes with a heavy price tag interest. In fiscal 2024, net interest payments hit $879.9 billion, consuming 13% of total federal spending. That's more than the government spent on Medicare or national defense that year. It makes interest the third largest expense category after Social Security and healthcare services. For years, low interest rates kept borrowing costs manageable even as debt piled up. But that changed in 2022, when the Federal Reserve raised rates to fight inflation. By July 2025, the average interest rate on federal debt had more than doubled from its January 2022 low of 1.556% to 3.352%, the highest since the Great Recession. Rising rates mean future borrowing will cost more, adding to the spiral of debt and interest that policymakers warn could crowd out essential investments. Who owns America's debt? The U.S. debt is held by a mix of domestic and foreign investors, federal trust funds, and the Federal Reserve. Private investors hold about 2/3, or $24.4 trillion, as of March 2025. Federal trust funds and retirement programs hold $7.3 trillion, and the Fed itself owns $4.6 trillion. But not just any phone call. On one end was Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and on the other, Brazil's President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Two leaders, thousands of miles apart, yet suddenly drawn into the same storm. That storm? A trade war unleashed by US President Donald Trump, one that's putting their countries directly in his crosshairs. What followed wasn't just a polite diplomatic exchange. It could be the early sparks of a global economic realignment. The Social Security trust funds alone hold nearly $2.7 trillion, while military retirement funds account for over $2.2 trillion, and Medicare's two trust funds hold about $425.3 billion. Looking back to December 2024, foreign investors owned about $8.5 trillion in U.S. debt, 23.5% of the total. Japan leads foreign holders with $1.1 trillion, followed by the United Kingdom at $809.4 billion and China at $756.3 billion. Mutual funds hold nearly $4.5 trillion, banks and similar institutions about $1.9 trillion, and state and local governments roughly $1.7 trillion. Pension funds, both public and private together, hold close to $955.7 billion, with the remainder scattered across individuals, insurance companies, and other entities. Trump's debt strategy and tariff revenue. President Trump insists he has a plan to bring the debt under control, relying on tariffs, cost-cutting, and economic growth. His Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, claims to have cut $202 billion in government spending, which works out to $1,254.66 in savings per taxpayer. But with debt per capita now above $108,000, those cuts barely dent the total. Tariffs have been another pillar of Trump's approach. The CRFB reports that tariff revenue has more than tripled in a year, from about $7 billion to $25 billion by late July 2025. Trump says these tariffs haven't fueled inflation and are simply pouring massive amounts of cash into the Treasury. Yet $25 billion is less than 0.07% of the national debt. Even if every cent went to debt repayment, it would take nearly 120 years to pay it all off, without accounting for the fact that interest and principal are still climbing. Economists warn that tariffs have side effects. While they boost customs revenue, they also raise costs for U.S. businesses and consumers, disrupt supply chains, and invite retaliation. In 2025, the budget deficit still expanded by roughly 20% year over year, partly because tariffs slowed exports in key sectors like manufacturing and technology. The BRICS Factor. While America grapples with its fiscal position, the geopolitical stage is shifting. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, has expanded to include new members like Indonesia and Vietnam. Far from splintering under U.S. pressure, the group appears to be tightening its ranks. Trump's America First agenda has singled out BRICS nations for punitive tariffs and public rebukes. He's threatened 100% tariffs on countries that try to undermine the US dollar, and an extra 10% on those backing anti-American policies from BRICS. At last month's BRICS summit in Rio de Janeiro, these warnings landed, but not in the way Washington intended. Instead of pulling members apart, they've strengthened their sense of shared purpose.
Speaking in widely shared social media videos, Lula stressed that the idea is not to undermine the dollar but to test an alternative for trade among BRICS nations. His remarks come amid heightened tensions with Washington. In January, President Trump warned of 100% tariffs on BRICS members if they moved forward with such a currency. And just last month, Trump added an extra 10% tariff on any nation aligning with what he calls anti-American policies of BRICS.
Strained ties with India and Russia. India, a nation the US has long considered a key counterweight to China, is one example. Trump hosted Pakistan's army chief for a private lunch at the White House in June, a move that rattled New Delhi. Soon after, he imposed a 25% tariff on Indian exports, followed by another 25% over its purchases of discounted Russian oil. India's Ministry of External Affairs called the measures unjustified and unreasonable. Relations with Russia are also tense. While Trump has positioned himself as a potential peacemaker in the Ukraine conflict, his actions have escalated nuclear risks. After former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev spoke about nuclear strike capabilities, Trump announced that U.S. nuclear submarines had been moved into appropriate regions. Moscow responded by abandoning its moratorium on deploying short and medium-range nuclear missiles. A summit between Trump and President Vladimir Putin is expected in Alaska this week, but deep differences over Ukraine and European security are unlikely to disappear in a single meeting. Tariffs target South Africa, Brazil, and China. South Africa faces 30% tariffs and a cutoff in U.S. aid, with Trump accusing its government of discriminating against its white minority and criticizing its legal case against Israel over the Gaza conflict. He's also announced he won't attend the G20 summit in Johannesburg in November. Brazil has been hit with a 50% tariff, reportedly because of President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's treatment of former leader Jair Bolsonaro, who faces accusations of leading a coup attempt in 2022. China remains Trump's main target, but there's still an effort to keep dialogue alive. A direct summit with President Xi Jinping is in the works, and trade talks in Stockholm recently resulted in a 90-day pause on escalating tariffs. Still, Analysts note that Trump's hardline tactics have reinforced Beijing's role as a rallying point for nations resisting U.S. economic pressure. Even the newest BRICS members aren't being spared. Indonesia has faced steady tariff threats since officially joining the bloc in January. Vietnam is contending with a 20% tariff and an additional 40% levy on goods suspected of being rerouted from China. Rather than peeling away members, these measures are pushing them together. A multipolar world taking shape. Trump's critics argue that his confrontational diplomacy is hastening the rise of the multipolar world he opposes. Every tariff, sanction, or public slap at a BRICS member reinforces their incentives to cooperate with one another. The bloc's unity has been strengthened by a shared perception that Washington is applying blanket hostility, regardless of individual nations' policies or potential alignment.
Now, Russian President Vladimir Putin is steering the BRICS nations through a crisis triggered by US President Donald Trump's tariffs. In the last 24 hours, Putin held talks with Prime Minister Modi, Xi Jinping and Ramaphosa as they unite along with Brazil to counter US trade aggression. The talks come ahead of Putin's meeting with the US President in Alaska next Friday. According to reports, the Kremlin said that the Russian President Putin, in his phone call with Indian Prime Minister Modi, discussed Ukraine and talks held with US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff.
This growing cohesion means BRICS isn't just surviving US pressure, it's thriving on it. And with America's fiscal position looking increasingly precarious, the prospect of an alternative global order becomes more attractive to countries seeking insulation from US economic leverage. The G20 summit in Johannesburg later this year will be a critical moment. Will US officials show up ready to engage, or will they double down on confrontation? The answer will be closely watched. So here's the question. In a world where the US is borrowing at record levels while key emerging economies draw closer together, who really holds the advantage and for how long? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.